Welcome back to our series on climbing movement. In our first video, we talked about how to recognize your existing movement patterns and why they might be holding you back. Today, we're going to dive into the psychology of motor learning to help you understand how to expand your movement toolkit. Many climbers get frustrated with movement learning because it's hard to benchmark the learning process. We can cognitively understand how a movement skill works way before we can replicate it on the wall. For example, knowing what a drop knee is versus actually using a drop knee are two very different things. This is because motor learning takes place directly in your central nervous system, and teaching your central nervous system new tricks requires targeted and methodical work. Let's unpack the phases of motor learning to understand how we can acquire new movement skills in climbing. The first stage in motor learning is the cognitive phase. In this beginning phase, athletes focus on gaining an understanding of how a skill is to be performed. This might involve watching someone else do the movement, or reviewing videos of the movement, or maybe listening to someone describe how to do the movement. From this information, athletes begin to develop a motor program for that skill. A motor program is an abstract and internal representation of the skill that helps the climber start to develop the basic movement pattern. Movement learning happens in your body, but it has to start with cognitive understanding. This phase tends to feel awkward, choppy, and exaggerated, which causes a lot of climbers to abandon movement learning completely. But feeling awkward and contrived is actually a really important part of the learning process. Your mind is starting to understand, but this is all brand new for your body. In the cognitive stage, working with a coach can really help you understand what you should be focusing on so you don't just feel like you're throwing spaghetti at a wall.
All right, so wanted to give an example here of how something can feel not intuitive, and you might not be able to see that it's an option because we have blind spots around things that aren't normal or not intuitive to us. But somehow doing that can actually be better for the movement. So we're gonna give an example here of one of our athletes doing the final move on this tension board 2 problem. And she has 2 feet pretty close together, and she keeps both feet on and does a drop knee. And she makes this move. However, it's pretty wild. And if she was super pumped on a sport route, maybe, this might not be the best way for her to do this move. And so I sent her back with some feedback in a way to do it a different way and with a different lower body configuration that didn't feel intuitive to her at first. Okay, so I sent her back with a different idea to try for the same move on the same TB2 problem. And I also get the high right foot, but instead of going and keeping both feet on with a drop knee, I keep my hip open and I drop my left foot off of the board. So a different lower body configuration for this same move. As I go and make that move then, it's very, very static and very, very easy to control. And so I sent her back with this feedback to try this new configuration, even though it wasn't the most intuitive one for her, to see what she thought. So then when she returned and tried it this way, she was able to say, like, this was definitely more stable, but it wasn't intuitive. And that's the big difference in kind of why it's important to try things that aren't intuitive, because often there's a lot there. And that's why a coach working with you and looking at your movement patterns throughout time can really open our eyes to what it is that can make things easier that we're not naturally seeing. And then we slowly build intuition for all of those different movement patterns. And that's how we really become very skilled climbers.
The second phase is the associative phase. The focus of this phase is skill refinement. Through targeted practice, the climber moves from having a general idea of how to perform the skill to being able to replicate the skill with accuracy and consistency. During the associative phase, the climber is gradually able to replicate the skill with less exaggeration. This is when accuracy and consistency begin to improve and the skill starts to become more automatic. Visual control of the movement is gradually replaced by proprioceptive control, which is the climber's ability to feel the movement. If you're working with a coach, they'll typically progress the drill at this phase to support you as you move through the stages of the motor learning process. We're going to cover the intricacies of drill design and progression in our next video, so be on the lookout for that. The associative phase typically lasts much longer than the cognitive phase, and the length tends to vary based on the complexity of the skill. The third and final phase of motor learning is the autonomous phase. At this phase, the climber is able to execute the skill while concentrating on other things besides technique. For example, if you're practicing a drop knee in the autonomous phase, you might be able to focus more on the way you're gripping the hold rather than what's going on with your knee. If you're working with a coach, they'll typically have you practice the skill in a variety of new contexts and on harder problems to increase your ability to perform the skill automatically. What I really want you to understand is that learning new movement patterns is possible, but it takes more than just a cognitive understanding of that skill's existence. So for example, intuitively and automatically knowing when to turn your hips is different than just kind of knowing that you should turn your hips sometimes. Cognitive understanding is a start, but you have to be willing to practice the skill over and over and over again, even when it feels awkward or kooky or exaggerated or wrong. It's part of the way your body learns. Working with a coach and getting really good at filming yourself and reviewing your footage will help you stay motivated through the learning process. In our next video, we're going to dive into how to design effective drills that correlate with the phases of motor learning. Stay tuned.